life and prospects of a newborn in a poor household or a poor country are different, certainly, from those in a wealthier society. And in all societies, long-standing forms of inequality persist, and the gaps are changing, as we are going to learn as we discuss the Human Development Report for 2019. My name is Lisa Bailey. Welcome to UETV, and I'm happy to have with me today Magdi Martinez-Soliman. He's resident representative for UNDP Barbados and the OECS. Mr. Magdi Soliman was appointed the resident representative of UNDP in Barbados and the OECS since June 2019, and he has a solid track record of accomplishments and vast experience in development. Until recently, and for the past few years, he has been Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and the Policy Chief of UNDP. Prior to that, he held different positions at the UN and at UNDP headquarters in New York. He holds a degree in law from the Universidad Complutense of Madrid and the Universidad of Malaga. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I also want to welcome Professor Winston Moore, of course, no stranger to UETV, I'm sure. He is Deputy Principal and also Professor of Economics. And prior to this, he held the position of Senior Economist at the Central Bank of Barbados. Professor Moore is an active public commentator on issues related to national development, and he's a former president of the Barbados Economic Society. His recent research has examined the issues surrounding the green economy, private sector development, as well as the economic impact of climate change on tourism. And over the last 5 years, he's been actively involved in the modeling of the economic impact of climate change on Caribbean countries. So they are well positioned to talk about the Human Development Report, which will be released today, December 9th. Welcome, gentlemen, and welcome to UETV.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now let's start by talking about the Human Development Report. What exactly is this report, and how long has this information been collected?
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for the question, because it sets the tone for what this report is. Let me take you back in the tunnel of time. 1968, Robert Kennedy has just announced his presidential bid. He is running for president of the United States. He goes to Kansas University. He's going to talk to students, and he makes a very warm, a very progressive speech in which he basically lambasts GDP growth, the measurement of traditional ways in which we assume a society evolves. And he says, and I quote, "GDP measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning. It measures everything except what makes life worthwhile." And I believe that Amartya Sen, Nobel Laureate in economics, and Mahbubul Haq, at the time finance minister in Pakistan, pick up that idea that GDP and growth only measured the dollars, only measured the output, and that there needed to be something better that would really portray how our societies fare in terms of well-being, in terms of our freedom, our choices, our education, our health, our agriculture, of course the output as well, and the income. How can we walk away from that? But they established the conceptual need to assess lives that we value. And then they develop a metrics, because you have to be econometric, you have to measure, you have to, as we say, we only count what counts. And they established the Human Development Index. And according to the index, you rank nations and societies according to their well-being. In 1990, they published the first Human Development Report, and ever since, UNDP, which stays away from interfering with the report, it's an independent report, it is produced by scientists, mostly economists, but also people from other walks of academic life. Since 1990, over the last 30 years, more or less, we have been publishing every year a report which has always its correspondent ranking of nations, and where that generates controversy, because who has lost a position or earned two, it's always a matter of discussion and of debate. Why did it happen? How could we lose? How can these ones be ahead of us, and so forth? We will have the occasion of discussing where Barbados and other countries in the Caribbean lie in terms of the ranking.
Okay. Now, are there any major changes in the 2019 report? I love the title, Beyond Income, Beyond Averages, Beyond Today. So that tells me there is a big difference.
There is a big difference in terms of the conceptual analysis, but no major changes in terms of the ranking of the nations. It doesn't happen overnight. The big changes happen when societies collapse, when societies go to war, when the economy crumbles, or to the contrary, when a society suddenly skyrockets. I think we will see in the coming years, if public affairs are managed properly, as I hope they would, Guyana take off. It is the fastest growing economy of the world. That will have an impact on human development. But so far, between 2018 and 2019, things have been reasonably stable.
Okay. Now, how do we assess these new inequalities? The report talks about a couple of new particular areas that we're focusing on.
So you speak, Lisa, about new inequalities. That means that we have already taken stock of the old ones. You mentioned it in your introductory note. The wealth of our parents is the basic starting point where the inequalities start. If your parents are richer than mine, obviously that gives us a starting point that is different. The place where we live, the country we're born in, the education we have access to, the healthcare that takes care of our well-being and of our vital constants. All that will have an effect. Those are the old inequalities. The new inequalities that the report brings to bear are two: technology and climate. People are not the same, are not equal in technology use and access. And people are not the same. We thought that it reigned the same for everybody. Well, it doesn't. Climate marks a difference between the people who have access to safe climate and the people who are at risk, who are in danger because of climate change. Those are the two elements that the report identifies as new inequalities that have started to make a dent in the demographics of our societies.
And Professor Moore, how do you see these inequalities, certainly as it relates to Barbados and the OECS islands?
I think these are fundamental drivers. Within the Caribbean, climate change is going to have a significant impact on the lives of the average Caribbean national. And it's quite amazing that it's going to have such a significant impact, given the fact that most Caribbean countries as a whole contribute such a small percentage to carbon emissions. If you sum all the carbon emissions by all of the Caribbean islands and put as a ratio to total carbon emissions, that is less than 1%. But Caribbean islands are going to face significant changes in the way in which they do business. So if you look at the tourism product in the Caribbean, most of the tourism infrastructure is located along the coastline. So any rise in the sea levels is going to have a significant impact on our coastal infrastructure and our tourism product. Even, for example, utilities. In most Caribbean countries, the power generation facilities are located along the coastlines. The airports are along the coastline. So our fundamental infrastructure is located along the coastline. Is going to be suffered significantly as a result of climate change and sea level rise. So that actually is going to be one of the significant changes in regards to inequalities in the Caribbean, and something that we're going to have to look at. Even beyond that, there's another factor that I haven't even mentioned as yet that is potentially linked to climate change, and the scientific evidence is still a little bit ambiguous in regards to this, and this is in regards to hurricanes. The scientific literature suggests that climate change is related not to the number of hurricanes that pass through the region, but the severity. And we have seen that in recent years. We've seen some tremendous storms passing through the Caribbean. They're not necessarily above average, but when they do pass over any Caribbean island, they have a significant impact. And that is going to have an impact not just on the number of deaths resulting from these extreme events, but also the economic activity. It's very difficult to bounce back from a storm after it has impacted on a small island developing state. And that will be a significant issue that we'll have to face, not just in the short term, but also in the long term as well. Another issue that we are facing as well is the impact of IT. At the University of West Indies, we have a number of programs aimed at IT and sort of training our Caribbean nationals in this area, because we understand that information technology is going to be a fundamental differentiating factor between those countries that are successful and those countries that are not successful. Because almost everything that we're going to do in the future is going to be related to IT technologies.
And even in terms of access, that was a discussion recently in terms of access to telecom in the region and what that means for us and how we compete. Is that what you're talking about?
In addition to access, the pricing, prices always comes up as economists, the price of as well as access are going to be important factors. The Caribbean always shows up as, in terms of the telecom statistics, relatively high in terms of mobile phone penetration rates, but Caribbean nationals tend to use their IT or IT devices for very low-level things, and that is, we need to move that to the next level, and that's where your education comes into play. So developing mobile applications, using those applications in terms of big data analytics as well, is going to be a really important part to helping in terms of policy making.
Okay. And are there some other areas that you would like to divulge a little more information on? I mean, and things are so linked. So technology is linked to education. And it's interesting that you said that, because even though we have all this technology, are we seeing that technology being used in our schools in Barbados and the OECS islands to maybe have a higher, have a higher level of a report? Are we seeing that the areas are overlapping and we're not doing as good as we could in the Caribbean?
It's one of the things that the report measures. It actually integrates the number of schools that are connected via internet. And there is no half tone. The benchmark is 100% of schools are internet connected. And that's not the principle. It's the students are connected, there is a Wi-Fi, computers are available, they can be used for research, even if it's basic research of kids at a young age. But it has become a technology must to have schools connected via internet. Now, Barbados is way ahead, so are the Bahamas and Trinidad. Some other islands are trailing behind, and it has to do with many factors. One is investment, of course, but it also has to do with the orography. Some islands are more mountainous. Some village schools are a little bit harder to reach. They have worse connectivity. So many things influence, but it is indeed, as Professor Moore was saying, there is a digital divide. There are people who have access and people who don't. There are people who can afford technology and people who don't. There are people who are using the technology of 10 years back because that's what they can pay for. And there are people who have the latest of the latest and the ultimate cry of whatever gadget is on the market. That is also making a difference today in terms of education, in terms of access to jobs, in terms of knowledge, culture, and information.
There's one more factor that we have to mention in regards to the Caribbean, and that's health.
I was about to say.
Whenever you speak about health in the Caribbean, one of the issues that always pops up is the whole issue of non-communicable diseases. And it is the fundamental driver in terms of deaths for any person beyond under the age of 70. So high blood pressure, cardiac arrest, strokes, all these issues are driven by our consumption patterns. So the fact that we consume lots of sugar, both adults as well as kids, our diet are all driven by the factors that are impacting on these health outcomes. And it is something that is fundamentally related to inequality as well. So the fact that you can afford to buy healthier foods drives that inequality that you see within the Caribbean as well. It also is related to the policies that we are seeing in the Caribbean as well. Policies that might drive that divide and policies that might potentially lead to a more homogeneous outcome as well. And it also could potentially be linked to IT as well, because you can use IT to help sort of monitor your performance in regards to your consumption patterns. And it can also be used to identify what are the key drivers of these diseases as well.
Do we want to say anything about the health indicators for Barbados and the OECS in terms of health? Have we seen any major changes in terms of maybe life expectancy, and have you seen anything?
Well, I mean, I speak under your control. You're a communicator on public health, so I'll defer to you, but check if what I'm saying resonates or makes sense with other sources of information. Totally agree with Professor Moore on NCDs. Non-communicable diseases are fundamental. There's a belief that the region, which has a very athletic ethos and culture of the body and of healthy lifestyles, is all like that, and it's not the case. In the poorer strata of society, sugary drinks, it's not a region particularly affected by tobacco, but it is affected by alcohol. It is affected by unhealthy food and lifestyles, by sedentarism, and so further and so forth. Second, obviously, health starts with health at birth, and health at birth has everything to do with the pregnancies, maternal health, prenatal health, and perinatal health. And there comes something that is a little bit more controversial, and it is family planning, unwanted pregnancies, adolescent pregnancies, and even nutrition, connecting NCDs with the pregnancies and the child health, has a lot to do with how the first years are going to unfold. Third factor, vaccination. The region does reasonably well on almost everything, perhaps except measles, where we have a little bit of a valley and still some gaps to cover. And third, we also need to look and never forget HIV and AIDS. This is not over. The crisis is not over. It is around us, and populations at risk and populations who think they are not need to watch out so that this does not start again and become what it has been in the past, something that we are about to overcome, but that is still a very important health risk.
Now, I understand most of these topics and how you measure them, but how do we measure dignity and respect for human rights? How do you measure that indicator?
Necessarily you use proxies, but there are many ways. Ultimately, if you witness let's put it from the grossest violations of human rights, extrajudicial killings, unlawful arrests, repression of freedoms, of expression, of demonstration, of rally, of association. If you have a situation where internet is heavily controlled, social media are shut down, if you have a situation where establishing an NGO is not an easy thing to do, and you're going to be asked for a number of requisites and requirements and legal obligations and what have you, you start seeing the dark hand of an authoritarian state. If you see that the police does not treat with respect, sometimes they don't treat with respect people depending on the ethnic group they belong to, depending on the religion they worship, depending on whether they're a man or a woman, depending on whether they're a senior citizen or a youngster. You also start seeing a pattern of lack of respect for dignity and for rights. And there is a specific sustainable development goal, SDG 16, that is all about that. It's about our freedoms, it's about our liberty, it is about the fact that our rights need to be not only enshrined in a piece of paper, be it the Constitution or a number of acts, but then enacted, made live by the powers of the state that have to protect them, that have to promote them, and that have to actively support them. We have a problem almost in every country of the world with the rights of some people who are particularly vulnerable. LGBTI, people who have a different lifestyle, who decide to love differently than others. Systematically, you will see some levels of repression. You will see some levels of curtailment of their freedom. As simple as, can they get a rent? Can they convince a landlord to rent them the house? Can they get a job? When they walk into a police station to complain about something that has happened, will they be treated differently? Will they be mocked? Will they be ridiculed? Will there be a scorn? It starts there. That is already a curtailment of rights. That is already a slippery slope that ends up with denial of rights. Not to speak about access to justice. That's one of the fundamental ways in which we measure. Some societies have a very, very difficult and narrow access for people who are poor. If you're rich, justice will be served. But if you're not, it will be harder. The lawyer is expensive. The court will not listen to you. You have a harder case, as they say. So there are definitely ways in which you can assess whether our freedoms and our liberties and our rights are strongly protected and promoted, or on the contrary, are kind of fragile and left behind.
Okay. Professor Moore, would you like to comment on that?
One of the things that we also have to consider within the Caribbean is the speed with which we receive access to justice. So while we might have access to
I was about to say, it's more than access.
Exactly.
Yes.
If it takes a long time for your case to be heard, that also impacts on the freedoms of the individuals as well. You know, it's also an issue in terms of the individual's freedom. And it's an issue that we have to consider here within the Caribbean.
Okay. Now let's talk a bit more about gender. In terms of gender, have there been any major shifts in the power imbalance that we have seen before, or is it pretty much the same?
I think there's been a big movement. The feminists have given us a better society. We are in a situation where quotas in political party representation, as we say, in the bedroom and in the boardroom, quotas in the presence, in the direction of companies. I just come from meeting an editorial board of one of the news outlets, most influential news outlets in Barbados. Half of the professionals were women. And I was telling them, look, 20 years ago, probably we would have had a meeting where I am a man, I would have met a boardroom of men. There would have been one lady, the lady would have been serving tea.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
We are in a different position. I think the Me Too movement has made a great contribution. A contribution to expose what is unacceptable at work, what is unacceptable in a professional setting, what is unacceptable anywhere, and that is that sexual violence and sexual aggression becomes something that happens in a cursory way in university, in my office, anywhere in where we operate. I believe that there is a change, starts with access to health, starts with access to education. It is well known that young girls are more proficient at school than young boys. They get less distracted, they're more focused. We still have a gap. The gaps that the reports show have to do with the masculinization of a number of professions. Science-related professions and studies, IT-related professions, engineering-related professions seem to be more for boys, just like in the past we said, well, a cab driver or a truck driver or a metal worker or a mason, those are professions for men. Mm-hmm. It's changing, but we still have those gaps. And of course, there's a pay gap that we still see there. It is about 30% in average in the world, in the most evolved and so-called civilized societies of the world. Still, for the same job, we don't have the same pay. So, glass half full, glass half empty. Still a lot to go, but clearly progress registered on many accounts.
You know, one of the key messages from this year's HDR report is the whole idea of moving beyond the means. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the averages, Magdi, I agree with you that the Caribbean has made significant progress in regards to gender equality. So if you look at the University of West Indies, the majority of students at the University of West Indies are female. If you look at most of our businesses within the Caribbean, the majority of middle management are made up of females. But when you start looking at the higher levels of the institution, the CEOs, you still see that gap in regards to male versus female. Most of our CEOs in the Caribbean for our large businesses are still primarily male. Mm-hmm. And you also see the gap in regards to wages, as well as the job market. So the male unemployment rate always tends to be lower than the female unemployment rate. The average level of wages for females always tends to be lower than the average level of wages for males as well. So you still have that, when you dig beyond the averages, you still have that gap for females. And I've done a bit of research on this as well, mm-hmm. in regards to financing. If you look at a similar business that is run by a female compared to a business that is run by a male, you'll find that female business is likely to have some challenges in regards to financing that enterprise, or sort of what we call financing constraints. Mm-hmm. And it isn't anything in regards to the sort of characteristics of the business. It largely is simply because the business is run by a female. And those sort of issues hold back female-owned businesses and female-run businesses in the Caribbean. And they also hold back development within the Caribbean. Because if you have so many females coming through the university, and they're starting businesses and they're running businesses, and you have this financing constraint, it therefore holds back growth within the Caribbean. And it is something that we need to look at within the region.
What is the solution for that one? Because I mean, you can talk about socialization at home and I can talk to my daughter, but how do we change that structure? With time it will change, or how do we fast track that change then?
This is an issue that I feel really uncomfortable speaking about, particularly since both of us are males.
That's okay. I'm here to balance it out.
Yes, you're here to balance it out a little bit. But I think what we need to do is ensure that we have equality in regards to how we treat businesses within the region. So we have to make sure that just because a business is run by a female compared to a business run by a male, that business doesn't face any restrictions in terms of access and finance. Access to finance is one of the fundamental things that impacts the success of a business. So if we could change that sort of fundamental issue, then we can have a lot more success in regards to our businesses. So equality of treatment is sort of a fundamental thing that we need to work on.
It's interesting that, I'm so sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that the obstacles that are put in the way of women are more and more irrational. At some point, you know, the hurdle was created even before. So you said, well, really, women who cannot obtain a driving license, well, they can't be truck drivers. So you had created the inequality before to justify the inequality thereafter. That disappears. You had created the inequality in education. So they weren't trained, they weren't capable,
Now
they didn't
trained.
have the knowledge, right?
Now they're trained.
And now they're trained.
Yeah.
So that, again, doesn't work anymore. You can't justify that anymore. There's been a number of justifications that have to do with physical strength. Oh, this job is very strenuous, or it's very hard, and so further and so forth. Go and see women working in agriculture and see if that's hard or not hard, and how hard they work. So again, an argument that almost collapses by its own demerit. I think that at some point, the argument is pure discrimination. What is left is pure discrimination. You're just paid less because you're a woman, and it suits whoever pays less to save that penny and justify it on the basis of gender. So that is also going to disappear. That's at least what I tell my daughter, that you can be whatever you want to be. And from the belief, from the conviction, from the persuasion that the sky is the limit, comes also, I think, the demand for the end of that discrimination. I feel that the end is near, that the reminder, the relic of discrimination that still exists is narrower and narrower and narrower. At some point, we will eventually turn that corner.
We can't wait for that to happen, though, because I've done some research in terms of new industries emerging within the Caribbean, the so-called green economy, green industries. And even within those new industries, you still see that discrimination. So, for example, a female working at a green business is likely to receive a lower wage than a male working at a green business. And it's largely because of the type of jobs that the business would employ females to do. So they would employ females to do lower skilled jobs. And then the males will be employed to do more higher skilled things like engineering and so on. So it's something that we need to still consider and still make sure that our policies are aimed at addressing those issues.
Just an epilogue to that point, if I may, Lisa. You were mentioning before that, and it is well known, it's well established, access to credit is more difficult for entrepreneurs who are women than who are men. Curious enough, and money should talk, women are better repaying their debts, in particular in microcredits, than men, for whatever reason. It's cultural, whatever it might be. So if I were a banker, especially a woman banker, I would think, let's place my loans with entrepreneurs who will repay me so that I can get the revolving door moving. I do believe, I agree with you. We need to make it move faster, but I think we're going in the direction of travel is the good one.
Okay. Now, what I was about to say before you started was some people will hear us talking about this whole feminist thing and say, oh, but the ladies are doing everything. They're in every area. I wanted to ask, in terms of our social structures and the men, a lot of people still believe men are in crisis. And we need to take some of the focus off women and more on men. What do you think about that in terms of our development, and there are more men in prison in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
In every country, I'm sure.
So just because we speak about female and female empowerment doesn't mean that we necessarily are leaving
about
behind
equity, right?
men. Exactly. So that was one of the policy recommendations that I provided earlier, that we want to provide equality in terms of treatment. So a female-owned business should have just as much access to credit as a male-owned business. So once we look at the issue of equality, then we bring everyone forward, not just females, but we bring males forward as well. And this brings up another issue that we face within the Caribbean. I think you mentioned it just now, the whole issue of crime. The Caribbean is actually one of the most violent places in the world. And when you actually sort of do some projections and look at the trends, it is a fundamental issue that we need to work on in the Caribbean.
It's not something we talk about.
Yeah, I know, unfortunately, and not
know?
something that economists speak a lot about as well, but it has an impact on your economic activity. And if you look at the trends in regards to crime, and this report talks a lot about statistics and digging into the numbers. If you look at the trends and we sort of project forward our crime statistics, the region is going to become even more violent in the future. And that will have an impact on our tourism product. It will have an impact on doing business within the Caribbean, and it will also have an impact on our social structures within the Caribbean. So it's an issue that we can't necessarily leave behind, and it impacts on both females as well as males. So females are used in the drug trade to transship drugs, and males are obviously selling drugs very regularly, and drugs are a fundamental reason behind all of the crime that we're seeing within the region, and we need to address that issue.
3 points on that conversation, that part of the conversation. One, this report is about inequality. Gender inequality is still one of the fundamental inequalities in our societies. North and South, big countries and large ones, it doesn't matter. Women do not have the same opportunities than men. It doesn't matter if we speak a lot about women and about their rights and how to address the problem. It is still a reality. Point number 2, security is one of the biggest assets for stability of the economy and for development. Conversely, the opposite is true. Insecurity, and in particular violent crime, is something that frightens the economy, foreign direct investment, not to speak about economies that are based on tourism. Tourism has cold feet and quick feet. It runs to somewhere else where they won't have a bad holiday. So that is something that touristic countries have to keep very seriously in mind. And third, regrettably, it is true that young, unemployed, idle males tend to be more involved in violent crime than their sisters and their equivalent females. So the reason why we have so many young men in prison is because most violent crimes are actually committed by young men. So again, something that we need to, ending how you started, start thinking about in terms of crisis of masculinity, because there are masculine roles that are today very shattered, and young men who don't know exactly how to adopt a positive, constructive, genuine, equal, and friendly masculine role that is proud, that is self-assured, that doesn't have any complexes, but at the same time doesn't recur to absurd macho stereotypes that are so dated and so away from what it should be, that their equivalent girls and young women can't work with that in a way. So I think it's an interesting discussion that we are having about the crisis of masculinity, especially in young age, and that has to do with violence and with adopting a more constructive lifestyle.
Now, this report does go beyond the income, beyond the averages, and beyond today. So it looks to the future. What will this mean in the future? So let's talk a bit about some of the developmental solutions to these problems. Speaking specifically about Barbados and the OECS, what are some of the developmental solutions we're looking towards?
Well, definitely, if we have identified climate change as one of those issues that we need to focus on, then adaptation to climate change is going to be very important. And there's a need to distinguish between adaptation and mitigation here. So mitigation is definitely reduce the level of carbon emissions from the region, which most Caribbean countries will do as they become more developed. And then adaptation is simply adapting to the effects of climate change. So the fact that you're going to get more violent storms, the fact that flooding and droughts, which is something really interesting that occurs as a result of climate change. You have extremes on both sides. So just because you're going to see flooding at one time of the year doesn't mean that you're not going to see droughts at another time of the year. And Caribbean countries are going to be impacted by both of these types of events. Are being impacted. And are being impacted. So then it has the implications for agricultural sector or tourism industry. All these important facets of the economy are going to be impacted by climate change. So one of the things that we would need to do is sort of build adaptation mechanisms to the effects of climate change. So one of the interesting things that a number of Caribbean countries are doing right now is that they're actually investing a lot in renewable energy. So countries like Jamaica, Barbados, other countries in Eastern Caribbean are making significant investments in renewable energy. Wind, solar are all going to be an important part of our future. And it builds adaptation into the system. The other thing that you need to do is, build stronger. You can't possibly build for the strongest natural disaster that would occur, but you can build maybe for the average storm that might occur from year to year. So that means you have to work on your building standards. You have to work on your setbacks from the coastline. So no longer put in each hotel on the beachfront. You might want to put the hotel a little bit further from the beachfront and allow other persons to maybe utilize the beach as well, something that has been traditionally done in some Caribbean islands as well. And that builds in sort of resilience into the system as well. And also the mechanisms that we have in place to rebound after these events. So one of the interesting things that a number of Caribbean countries have been doing within their debt agreements is that they've been putting a small little agreement in there saying that maybe we wouldn't have to pay back the principal. If there's a natural disaster, we'll just maybe pay back the interest, or we'll have a lower rate of interest if there's a natural disaster. So it builds in a little bit of a resilience as a result of natural disasters. And those are the type of things that we'll need to work on. And then education. The Caribbean does not invest a lot in its educational or in its people. If you look at the number of Caribbean persons going to tertiary level training, it's very low. And even persons leaving our secondary schools with any type of qualification, it's also very low as well. So we need to work on education from, to some extent, the bottom all the way up to address those sort of fundamental challenges that we're seeing within our region, because you cannot have a strong, vibrant, sustainable economy unless you invest a lot in your education of your people.
And we're not just talking about university. We're talking about university. Technical and vocational training. Yes.
Exactly, because you can't just have everyone trained at university. You need to have persons trained in your technical areas as well to sort of fulfill those needs that you're going to have in the tourism industry, agriculture. So lots of training in that area is going to be needed. And some of these skills are going to cross over as well. So if you train someone in energy, that person can work in agriculture, can work in tourism, because those sort of crossover skills are going to be needed in the future. So investments in education, investments in climate change adaptation are two key things that I see are useful going forward in the future.
Would you like to talk a bit about health and some of the solutions? I know we have lots of countries making policy changes in terms of health and trying to tackle childhood obesity in the Caribbean. Can you tell us a bit about some of the solutions you see coming out?
Yes, certainly. I was going to volunteer the baseline. Perhaps that's useful to see where we have arrived at, and I think that the news are very good. The whole Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean, certainly the Eastern Caribbean, is in the group of high human development societies of the world. Starting with Barbados is number one. At the 56th rank of the world. Continued with the Bahamas, 60th. Continued with Trinidad and Tobago, 62nd. Follows St. Kitts and Nevis, has taken over Antigua and Barbuda, 73rd and 74th. St. Lucia, 82nd. 85th, Grenada. 98th, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And last but not least, Dominica, owing a lot to dangerous climate and devastation by hurricanes. So even Dominica, which is at the 100th of 180 countries in the world, still has reasonable indicators that speak to realities that exist in the country. The levels of investment in education or in health are insufficient if you measure them with the richest countries of the world, but they are okay. They are not minute or completely insufficient with regards to the budgets the countries have available. You were asking, Lisa, where do we go from here? What are the solutions for the future? I think there's one lesson to be learned from the past, is that investing in social safety nets, investing in social policy, investing in social protection, and investing in good quality, high-level public services, education, health, but also infrastructure, and the most modern infrastructure, IT infrastructure, technology infrastructure, pays off. Those things work. Those things give you better societies, give you more equal societies. So why not take a page from that book and continue persevering in the idea that a more educated, healthier, better trained, better work ethos aware and informed population that has access to a number of public goods, like a good airport, good ports, good roads, good hospitals and good schools, is actually a better society than the opposite. It seems like an obvious thing to say, but actually when you see policies that are surrounding us, people who disinvest, people who privatize, people who decide that, after all, it is not the business of the state to maintain public health or public education or public university or even public security, well, they're wrong. And they are wrong in facts and figures, as proven by Human Development Reports and so many other studies.
Now, I remember when we started to hear about the 2030, the Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, it seemed like so far away. It's not so far away right now. What does all of this mean for our attainment of those 2030 goals?
It's a tough one, because we are far away from achievement. We're not on track. The bad news, now that we have spoken about so many good news, the bad news is we still have 600 million horrendously abject poor in the world. 1.3 billion if you measure them with the multi-dimensional poverty index, which is, for our audience, a more complex way of measuring poverty beyond just income, just dollars. People who don't have a fridge, people who don't have enough money and need to make trade-offs between clothing for their children and clothing for themselves, or between paying the electricity bill and paying transportation. These kind of real tough choices. We are not on track in terms of reducing poverty. We're not on track in terms of reducing hunger. We're doing better in terms of coverage of education than in terms of quality of education. Yes, everybody's at school, but what is the content? How well trained are our teachers and professors? Are we really transmitting the knowledge that will allow young people to obtain meaningful jobs in the future? I could go on and on. What I mean to say is that you can't lower the guard and let things just happen by themselves, because the Sustainable Development Goals will not happen by themselves. They require hard work, they require stubborn investments, they require public policies, they require conviction and values, and I think that some governments are very much onto that. I can see other countries in the world slipping, deteriorating their position, and achieving less and less rather than more and more, which science, technology, and knowledge, one would imagine, allows them to do. But these are also policy choices. And one of the things that the report says is that it's all about choices. It's all about what we decide to do.
And I think one of the good things about this year's report is that it focuses on the issue of inequality. This also shows up in the 2030 development agenda as well. So this year's report allows us to get an assessment of where countries are going in regards to this issue of inequality, and also identify what are the key drivers. So something as simple as IT. and how that is impacting on poverty and inequality across the world. Also, the whole issue of education and how that is driving or leading to greater inequalities as well. How the fact that an individual born in a poor country has significantly worse outcomes than an individual born in a country with relatively higher level of human development. Those sort of issues that are highlighted and assessed within this year's HDR report allows us to get an assessment of these issues quite early so that we can then put policies in place to then meet those 2030 development agenda items.
Now, this report takes a very positive approach, though. It does say that tackling inequalities is not easy, but it does say that it is possible. And whose job is that? Is this just for policymakers to look at it and make a change? Is this for everyone? Whose job is it to address these inequalities?
I think this issue has to be tackled across all stakeholder groups, because if you just leave it to policymakers, then you're still not going to hit those the 2030 development goals. So it has to be tackled, say, within your company. You have to have policies within your company that encourage gender equality. You have to have policies in your company that address the issue of climate change. So looking at the policy goals and objectives for 2030, it has to be tackled by all of our stakeholders. Policymakers are just one group of the stakeholders. They're a very important group of the stakeholders, but it has to be something that is tackled by all of our stakeholders within the regions.
I couldn't agree more. I think Professor Moore is right. It's an issue that calls upon all of us, communicators and journalists, intellectuals and thought leaders, people who are in the international development cooperation practice, of course, governments and decision makers, but also the people who are watching us, also young people who are pushing the agenda of climate change, the agenda of social equality, the agenda of protecting our natural resources, activists, students, workers, women movements. It is about the choices that we need to make to live in better societies. And I think that is something that if you just sit back and hope that somebody's going to do it in your stead, you're up for a bad surprise. But if you participate and get the needle moving, you will see actually change happening. And that's what this report is also about, to say, yes, we have the figures, we have the facts, we have the knowledge and the science, but nothing replaces the moral compass and the push that our convictions and our values allow us to move societies in the right direction towards.
Okay. Do we have any final words? Any last words you want to leave the audience with?
Yes, definitely. I think this year's report focuses on the whole issue of inequality, and I think that is actually quite useful. Inequality is one of those issues that impacts on so many different aspects of Caribbean economies. It impacts on education, impacts on health outcomes.
Impacts everything.
So if we can have policies that are targeted at these issues, it could definitely have a significant impact on sustainable development outcomes within the region.
Okay, Mr. Mayor.
Perhaps at a more philosophical level, I think that perfect equality doesn't exist. We're all different. What is not right is to have levels of unfairness in our society that doesn't allow us to attain our potential. We need to have access to opportunity. We need to have the possibility to develop that potential. And that's what the report advocates, that, equality policy is about letting people attain their potential, letting people become what they dream that they can become one day, and not putting hurdles along the road. That's perhaps also what in the UN we stand for, and what certainly UNDP tries to present with the Human Development Report 2019.
Okay, well, thank you very much, gentlemen. And I hope you learned something today, and you will also go and seek out this information and also get moving in terms of making a difference in this region. So I hope you learned something today about the Human Development Report. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here with me. And we hope to see you on another show on UWE TV again soon. Thank you.